Hey, welcome to JT's Thoughts. These videos won't have much visually, so you can listen to it in the background without missing anything. I'll also have some timestamps below for the different sort of topics that I have here, or the different pros and cons for things. And I'll pretty much just talk about different subjects in this series that I see discussed and that I know people are curious about, and I'll just give you some of my thoughts. A little bit in depth on what I think. So for this video in particular, it's going to be as a gold or silver player, and I say gold or silver, but this really applies to all ranks. Should I watch Korean Challenger replays to improve? And what I would say about this is it depends a lot on your rank and what your goals are for League. You should think of it like learning a language. Basic knowledge in a language would be like gold in League. Advanced knowledge would be like diamond, and fluency would be like becoming a pro player. So watching Korean Challenger replays is basically the equivalent of watching a foreign TV show of a language you want to learn without subtitles. Assuming you have basic knowledge, you won't be able to understand very much, and you won't get much out of it. With advanced knowledge, such as being a diamond player in League, you'll understand a bit more and learn some things here and there, and you'll learn a lot if you focus. With fluency, you might learn a new word or phrase, perhaps a character has a strange accent that you haven't heard before. You'll understand the conversations that the characters, or champions, are having. What I'm getting at here is that you have so much more to gain as a fluent speaker when you're watching that TV show with no subtitles. It's often said that it's best to dive deep into a culture, or even just to move to a country that speaks the desired language to learn it. But in order to really learn it, you have to spend thousands of hours being involved and making an effort. So even if you were to go to that place, or even if you were to watch a lot of Korean Challenger solo queue, you kind of have to know what you're looking at. And along with that effort, you'll want to have dictionaries to learn the finer details from fluent speakers as well. So along with the dictionaries, you'll have to have some people to talk to about things. I've often heard it's good to have a mentor when you're learning a new language to just make sure you have everything kind of in the right place. And even then, even fluent speakers or native speakers themselves don't know everything. But it's still good for those who want to dive deep to just like put yourself out there and get into that culture, or for those who want to become the best League of Legends players to look at Korean Challenger replays. To gain basic knowledge in a language, or to hone your skills to an advanced level, it would be better to take some classes or watch some instructional videos rather than to just watch a TV show without subtitles in the foreign language. So a lot of the time I'd say if your goal is something other than reaching Challenger or having a profession in League of Legends, then you shouldn't spend a lot of time looking at Korean Challenger replays. But there are some reasons why you should spend some time looking at Korean Challenger replays, even if you are somewhat low elo. And I have some of those reasons here. As a summary, you should look at Korean Challenger replays to gain matchup knowledge and or champion knowledge. So in no particular order, I have these reasons. The first reason is to learn specific champion combos and when to use them. So especially when it comes to complex champions, which aren't recommended for lower elo, but I know some people do like to play them, like Azir, or like Callista, or other champions that have a lot to their kit and a lot of different things that you can do. Looking at Korean Challenger replays and some of the best players, like pro players who have played these champions a lot, can be super helpful for becoming proficient at that champion. I'd recommend doing that after you've already watched like a guide on the champion. There's usually some good basic guides out there for learning a champion, and hopefully they're not too long. Some of them are pretty long and in-depth, but you should get a good general idea of how the champion functions. You know, you can even take the champion in a practice tool and then watch the Korean Challenger replay. Don't just start with the replay and then, just try to figure it out from there. Another thing that I just thought of while you're looking at the replays, you can look at the cooldowns as well. Maybe you're watching a replay of a champion that you don't play as very often, but you want to get an idea of how someone should play them well. Like if you're like a master challenger player and you're curious about how you would play a matchup against a specific champion, you can look at their cooldowns as they use them to see how long different abilities take to come back up. Like obviously that's what a cooldown is, but I'm saying like you get that visual of like seeing the clock kind of tick on the ability bar when in spectator mode. When you're focused on that champion, you can see, you can get that visual. Another reason is to gain a finer understanding of some laning phase fundamentals, such as trades, or like when to rotate on your champion, or like how, like which direction you should go, like should you flank, and also back timings. These sorts of things can definitely be important, and certainly looking at Korean Challenger replays will help you figure out the right way to do these things. Another thing is you can see how to play a specific matchup, like how do players interact in the 1v1, and what cooldowns are important to bait and dodge. In a lot of matchups, especially in solo lanes, there's very influential abilities that the different champions have, such as like Ahri has her charm, in top lane Alawi has her E, and there's different things like that to keep in mind. One powerful ability with a long cooldown, this isn't always true. There are some champions that just have short cooldowns across the board or long cooldowns across the board. Some champions have abilities that reset other abilities and things like that. You can also try to get a better idea of how people use their passive abilities in different matchups. So one thing that comes to mind would be like Camille, her shield that she gets off cooldown like every 12-ish seconds in the early game. How they use that, whether they use it proactively or if they save it for when like the enemy champion engages on them. You can look at those sorts of things. Another reason is if you want to focus on one thing to learn, such as how to trade in certain matchups or how to die less. So this is something that I'd say is really important for not only looking at Korean Challenger replays, but also your own replays. It's good to go in thinking of one specific thing to target, like one area to focus on. For myself, a lot of the time I focus on deaths. So why did I die here? How could I have prevented it? Could I have traded 1-for-1? Could I have gotten off more damage before I died? Just completely revolving around my deaths when I look at that replay. And I'll do that when I look at Korean Challenger replays too. Although usually I won't focus on their deaths, maybe I'll focus on how do they use their Q throughout this game, or how do they get their CS throughout this game, or how do they zone their opponent. You can just come up with all sorts of different topics. How do they avoid ganks? How do they ward? Although sometimes warding is jungler specific too, so if you're looking at how someone wards, you should be keeping in mind what jungler they're playing against, so why they would ward in a certain area versus that jungler. Like against Evelyn past level 6, when she's invisible, usually you want to ward her camps, and you don't just want to ward like a nearby like Tribrush or something because she's just going to be invisible anyways. But if you ward her camps, then you can see, okay, she's there for sure, and now I have a little bit of time where I can play aggressively. Or if she's on the other side of the map, like if she's at Krugs in your top lane and she's on, you know, the Krugs on the other side of the map, not the red side Krugs, she's on the blue side Krugs, then you know you have a good amount of time where you can be aggressive, assuming you know where the mid laner is and you know where the support is. So it's good to focus on one topic at a time when looking at replays. And this is super important as well. Keep in mind that some of these reasons lose their viability as reasons to watch if you're unable to identify why something worked or didn't work. So everything is about context in League of Legends. I've said this so many times, like it's a really dynamic game, and like I just mentioned with that warding thing, you could go into a game thinking, oh, I'm gonna look at how this guy wards. You know, you're looking at how Faker wards, but let's say he was against like a farming jungler like Sejuani, who, you know, can gank, but you would ward differently against Sejuani a lot of the time than you would against like Shaco or Rek'Sai, champions who are notable for their extremely strong early game ganks. And for something like Zac, where oftentimes Zacs will gank from like the Raptor camp, or they can just gank from really far away, so you can ward, but you can't always feel completely safe against certain junglers. Really, you should never feel completely safe in League. You should always have some sort of escape plan in your head. So keep that in mind. Here's some other reasons. There's a special reason that I have listed here. If you want to go into a League of Legends profession, like being a coach, being a player, even being a caster, it can be good to look at replays just to have a really good idea of how the game should work at the optimal level. And that way you can discuss what a player should have done differently, or why they did that thing a certain way, or even as backup for strengthening your argument, reinforcing a point you just made. You can talk about how you see Korean challenger players do that, or you saw like Faker do this, or Rookie, or whoever. A bonus reason is if you can interpret what you're seeing in the gameplay, then that can be a good reason to look at a challenger replay. I'd say most players below high diamond won't have a great idea of what they're actually watching. An example off the top of my head is how Twitch chat reacts to certain things in pro play, like early flashes, and people using ults on the wave so they can get a good recall. People will spam question marks in chat. So like if you had a group of random Twitch chatters and you surveyed them individually on why a pro player did, like why did a pro player ult the wave, or why did they flash in that situation, they don't really understand. They just think it's dumb, and they think like that was a mistake or something along those lines. But if you took a survey of other pro players, they would at least be able to see, oh yeah, he ulted the wave here because he wants to get a good reset off, that way he doesn't miss creeps to the tower when the enemy pushes their wave in. Or he flashed when he did, even though he's full health, because he's gonna have to flash anyways, so he might as well flash before he loses a lot of HP, and that sort of stuff. And just one thing I want to note with this, I believe that pro players make tons of mistakes. I think they're human. I don't see them as untouchable gods like some people do. Some people out there who say like, how can you question a pro player, like they're a pro and you're not? But really, like, pro players make lots of mistakes. That's just the reality of it. Some more than others, of course, but every pro player makes mistakes. But yeah, there are a lot of things that pro players do that just go over the heads of people who don't understand the game as well as they do. Don't take that personally, you know, it's just, this is the way it is. A lot of the time, people, especially like Diamond and below, and even up into Master and Challenger as well, they just don't have a full understanding of the game. I mean, nobody really has a full and complete understanding of League of Legends. I feel like there's just so much depth to the game. Some people understand a lot of it, but usually there's something you can learn, no matter how smart you are about the game. So another reason is just entertainment, to see how the game is played by the best players. Yeah, it's mostly entertainment value for someone who lacks understanding. So like if you aren't able to interpret what you're seeing in the gameplay, then it's pretty much just going to be entertainment value for you. So moving on to why shouldn't you look at Korean Challenger replays, and a lot of these things will apply to most people, yeah, just most people in general. So the summary of these reasons is that there are more efficient ways to improve. And let's begin in no particular order, because the game will be played very differently overall. Players understand champions better, and the game as a whole at a higher level. So if you're like a person watching this and you're gold, you're silver, you're bronze, the game is just going to be played really, really differently in your solo queue games than it is in Korean Challenger games, because there's just like the players just have so many more hours in the game, and even if they don't have more hours in the game, they understand the game better. So it may not be the best learning tool for you. In fact, I'd say it's definitely not the best learning tool for you. Another reason is that you might not be able to understand the finer details like movement, wiggling, proper spacing, bait and gank coordination. Like you might see the way someone's playing and you might want to mimic that, but you don't actually know why they're playing that way, and so that's a problem. So you kind of need someone to interpret the information for you, someone who understands the game at a higher level. So another reason would be that you might start to have unrealistic expectations of your teammates because you see the way that someone played a game. Like let's say you have a Thresh on your team and the enemy team has a Zac, and the Zac jumps in, and you see the Thresh in the Korean Challenger replays. They will flay the Zac out of his jump, but in your game, your Threshes probably won't do that. I mean, especially if you're below Diamond, and even then, like. Even in pro play, you see pro players mess up those sorts of mechanics. So, yeah, you just don't want to have unrealistic expectations of your teammates, and then you definitely don't want to hold your teammates to those unrealistic expectations, because that's how you get a lot of these sort of toxic conversations in chat, is because someone has an expectation of how something should work, but someone else has a different expectation. And one of them might be more realistic towards their elo, and another one might be more realistic to how the situation should optimally be played. So, yeah, you just need to be careful with your expectations of your teammates. And Korean Challenger replays could definitely, like, they'll do one of two things. Like, either you'll expect more of your teammates if you're in high elo, or you'll expect, like, less, like, way, way less of your teammates if you're in lower elo, just because you start to see things in perspective. So next up, it's time consuming. This is a big one. It's often more beneficial to just play the game or look at content geared towards players of your skill level rather than to spend hours and hours and hours watching Korean Challenger replays. Now, for someone like myself, I've watched, like hundreds of hours, maybe even thousands of hours at this point of Korean Challenger replays. And I know for a lot of that time at the start of it, I wasn't actually getting that much out of it because I struggled in some of these areas, which I'm going to talk about more. I struggled in some of these areas where I actually wasn't getting that much out of looking at Korean Challenger replays because I failed to understand some of these things. And I had heard some people saying like, oh yeah, you should look at Korean Challenger replays if you want to get better. And especially nowadays, I feel like it's becoming more and more of a thing where people are saying, oh, if you want to get better at League, you should go and look at Korean Challenger replays, watch the best play. And that's the whole reason why I'm making this video, so you can have a better idea of when it's actually good to look at replays and what you should be looking for in those replays, and how to keep yourself grounded, like when you're looking at the replays, and stay realistic on what you're actually getting out of them. So yeah, you would often be better served just playing the game or looking at content that's geared towards you, guides that are geared towards your skill level. Or, sometimes streamers, like there's some educational streamers out there that can help in certain ways. Next reason is that even the best players make mistakes. You may see something that a player does that works out without realizing that they got a bit, quote unquote lucky. Now I say lucky here because I'm thinking of a situation where, let's say like I'm playing, or I'm watching someone play Zoe and they're against a Yasuo, and the Zoe flashes in and uses their sleep, and then the Yasuo doesn't wind wall it in time. And then you think, oh, well, I should flash an E as Zoe against Yasuo, but, there could be all kinds of things to that equation where maybe the Zoe player knows that the Yasuo's wind wall is on cooldown because they baited it out a little while ago with their Q, or their jungler baited it out, like their Nidalee threw a spear and the Yasuo wind walled it. So now the Zoe player has an opening where they can flash in an E, and it has a good chance of hitting the Yasuo player. Now you also have to consider, could the Yasuo have dashed to a minion? Were was the nearby minion on cooldown? You know, because Yasuo's E, you can't dash to the same target multiple times within a short time span. There's a cooldown on that. So there's all sorts of things that go into this equation of why something worked when it possibly shouldn't have, or it won't work in your games, and that's kind of what I'm getting at here with the lucky in quotations. So yeah, moving on to the next reason. You may start to develop a false sense of respect for your opponents, assuming that your opponent will react properly if put under pressure. For example, the trainee who is watching the KR Challenger VODs may just assume that they can't win their lane, in a solo queue game because it's a bad matchup, or they got counterpicked, so they won't even test their opponent or try to get an advantage when in reality most players don't know how to play lane matchups properly. This is a big one, because some people will see that they got counterpicked in Champ Select, and they'll think, oh, well, guess I can't win my lane, or this is a loss, or whatever. They get in the game, and they think that the only way they can win is if their jungler helps them, or something along those lines, when really, pretty much up into like high diamond, any lane is winnable. Once you start to get towards high diamond, master, grandmaster, and so on, people have a better understanding of how to play their lane individually. But even then, you'll see pro players win lanes that they aren't really supposed to win against challenger players, you know, they're supposed to be really good at laning phase. That's a lot of how they get the challenger, because laning phase is a big part of the game. But they find opportunities and ways that they can win the lane, even though it's a bad matchup. So yeah, you don't want to develop a false sense of respect for your opponents. You need to pressure them and like push them, and push yourself to win matchups that you're not supposed to win. Because let me tell you, like, you should be able to win pretty much any lane, you know, like I'd say like 95% of your lanes or more if you're below diamond, just like 1v1 or even 1v2. You know, even if you're getting camped, you should still be able to win your lane a lot of the time. Now, of course, champion picks do play into this, so this may not necessarily be true for some of you. I'm speaking very broadly. Obviously, there's a lot of champions and stuff in League, but you need to focus on yourself and the things you can change. Don't let like your opponent's champion picks and things like that persuade you that you are not going to be able to win your lane just on that merit alone. Like, you have to play the game and figure out, like, can you actually beat this person? That's one thing I do in a lot of my games, is I'll like probe my opponent, and you know, I won't take super high risks, but I'll take some risks just to see like what they do, how they react under pressure, and things like that. So yeah, you have to probe your opponent. You have to gauge them and see how they react to different things. So next up, overstimulation. This is something that can definitely happen where you're focusing on learning too many things at once. And this is why I said over here in the why should you things, reasons, to focus on one thing. Overstimulation can definitely happen where you're looking at a Korean challenger play and you're seeing, like, let's say they're playing Xerath and they're getting their CS and they're also using their abilities to push the wave and hit the enemy and still hitting their CS. And they're doing all these things right, and they're avoiding this gank and like landing this skill shot, and they predicted where their opponent would dash or flash to or whatever. And you're trying to take on way more than you can handle. You know, like, yes, we're like good at learning things as humans, you know, like we're pretty good at getting an understanding of things as long as we have an open mind and we want to improve and we learn from our mistakes and things like that. But I think it's definitely possible to focus on too many things at once and overwhelm yourself, which could definitely end up in you feeling discouraged, feeling like, you know, you're never going to measure up to whatever elo you want to get to. Like, let's say like you feel like you're just never going to make it to plat or diamond or master or whatever, and you start to just see the things that these players do and you wonder how they even thought of that or came up with that. Like, you know, just the other day I was thinking of this example where Miski was playing Zoe, and he went to dive top lane, and there was a wave of creeps in the way, but he stepped out of the brush to dive top lane because they were diving the red side top lane tower, and there was a line of minions, and he got aggro from the minions, so they started to walk towards him, and that opened up a gap where he could jump in, hit his Q, and hit his E onto the enemy top laner, where if he didn't get the minion aggro, that never would have worked. And there were people commenting, there's like a Reddit post about it, and they were saying, wow, that was amazing, I never would have thought of that. This is like how you know like pro players are just on a whole nother level. And yeah, to an extent that's true. Like a pro player really sees the game differently than most people do, and that's because they've learned how to see that game in that light, you know, through like repetition and experience and learning from other good players and being ready to understand why something worked or why it didn't work. So they take in all the information, they look at things in context. It's super important in League, and yeah, that's how pros are like so good. So next up, there are more efficient ways to learn how to get better at lower skill levels. I feel like I kind of already mentioned this with like looking at content that's geared towards you, but just to reinforce that, you're probably better off spending your time looking at other things or just playing the game. You know, just play the game and try to improve. Like, you can look at your own replay. I'd say this is a great starting point for people who want to look at their replays and learn things from them. Is just like, look at how you died and look at all your deaths throughout the game and think, how could you have prevented that? Should you have respected the jungler in this situation, which most of the time you should respect the jungler. If you don't know where the jungler is, you should probably just assume that they're coming to kill you, because I mean, that's just the way it works out a lot of the time, right? Especially if you're low and the enemy's low and you're in a situation where you're thinking, I could kill them, but there's a good chance I die if the jungler's here. And then what do you know? The jungler's there when you went to try and kill them. So yeah, just focus on learning things that, you know, you're able to learn from, like learning from things that you're able to learn from. You know, you can look at different coaching sessions for people towards your skill level from trusted sources. This is something I'll talk about more. Learn from trusted sources of people who know their stuff, and question what people say. You know, don't just take things at their word. Don't just take people at their word, even if they're like one of the best players in the world, even if they're a challenger player, that sort of stuff. Be willing to think critically about why someone says something and whether or not it's really true. So next up, lack of mistakes leads to less punishes. In Korean Challenger, people don't do as many dumb things, therefore you won't get a better understanding of how to punish players who do dumb things. So I feel like this is a lot of the reason why Unranked to Challenger series are so popular, is because people want to see how pro players punish the mistakes that players are making in their elo, or, you know, streamers or smurfs or whoever, not necessarily pro players. But even like a diamond player in a silver game will basically look like a pro player a lot of the time, as long as like they're on their role and playing their champion. And they'll just destroy everyone because they see these mistakes that other players in that elo don't really see, and therefore don't really know how to punish. So when you're looking at Korean Challenger replays as a silver player, they're just naturally playing the game way different than your lane opponent will. So like if you're a silver mid laner and you're trying to learn how to play, you know, like Annie versus LeBlanc or something, and you watch that matchup how it happened in Challenger, it's going to be way different. And the LeBlanc in your elo is going to make way more mistakes than the LeBlanc in Challenger elo. And you just always have to be ready to punish mistakes. And on top of that, you have to identify what is a mistake, which there's plenty of videos out there that can help you figure that out. And, you know, this video is mainly just focusing on the stuff that I'm talking about. So I would highly encourage you to, you know, just continue to learn from content that's geared towards your skill level, and yeah, don't worry too much about looking at Korean Challenger videos, depending on why you're looking at them. Because, yeah, this reason right here, lack of mistakes leads to less punishes. So next up, you could gain some ego from thinking that you've somehow inherited skill from watching Korean replays. You know, I feel like this applied to me a good bit a while back, where I was thinking, I've watched so many replays and I understand so many things and I know how to play the game well, but like this led to me focusing too much on things that didn't really fit in the context of the game. So for instance, I would focus a lot too much on farming and being at like 10 CS per minute, because I saw that happen in a lot of Korean games, but also in those games there were way less kills, way less early skirmishes and random river fights and stuff like that, and I wasn't taking that into account. So as someone who's made this mistake, where as like a master player I was thinking like, you know, how come I can't reach Challenger? I've watched all these replays and I'm doing all these things right, you know, like what's the problem? And I was thinking like I deserve to get Challenger because I put all this time and effort in, and that's where some big issues start. When you start to think that you deserve an elo, you know, that's okay to an extent, because you still should be able to recognize your mistakes and your errors in your thought processes and stuff like that. You shouldn't think that, you know, like you deserve to be an elo and the only reason you aren't in that elo is because of your teammates or your luck or whatever. That's very, very poor, and that won't lead to improvement at all. So yeah, moving on. You won't play based on the context of the game, and instead you'll try to mimic what you watch. And this is huge. This is sort of like what I was just describing. I would see pro players play on the Korean replays, and I would think, oh, that's how I should play. I should do it this way. And like, oh, I shouldn't walk over to this river fight if I'm gonna miss like, you know, 2 or 3 CS or whatever. And just stuff like that, where so often it'll pay off, especially in lower elos, to just walk over to those fights, because people won't adjust, you know, they won't move around. I mean, all the way up in a Challenger in North America, you know, like I think of like people who play roaming champions like Talon, Aurelion Sol, Katarina, and you'll ping these things out that they're roaming, but your teammates don't respect it at all. Whereas in like Korean Challenger, they respect it so much more, and they'll give up like a couple more CS in order to be ready for the roam. Now, that's not to say that they're perfect, like they still die to those roams. It just happens a lot less often. And that's why in certain regions, certain champion picks are a lot better than in Korea, and specifically in solo queue. So yeah, you have to play the game based on the context of the game that you're playing. That individual game on the Rift, it's just, you have to learn and adapt based on what's happening. So that's a thing I want to make into a video. It's just such a broad topic to talk about, where like you need to be ready to adapt to different situations. Problem solving, decision making is like the most important thing in solo queue, I'd say. You know, mechanics help. Mechanics can get you to high elo, but decision making, I'd say, is the number one important quality or like aspect of critical thinking that you need to be successful in League of Legends solo queue, I'd say. And finally, at the end of the day, Korean Challenger replays can be useful for learning, but the raw footage won't teach you by itself. Like, you won't learn anything. Like, if you're expecting the video to like communicate something to you, you know, it's weird to say it, like, you know, you're probably like, what the heck is this guy talking about? But like, some people think that just because they're watching Korean Challenger that they're improving, when that's just not the way it is at all. It goes back to that language analogy that I was talking about, where like, you can't just pull up, like, let's say I want to learn Spanish, I can't just watch the KEKW video over and over and over, you know, like E2, you know, like if I watch that over and over and over without subtitles, you know, like maybe I'll kind of get an idea of what a word means, but like without any context, like it's just not going to be very useful for learning Spanish. And in that same token, it's not going to be very useful for learning how to play League of Legends just simply by watching Korean Challenger replays. You have to be able to like infer pieces of information from watching the replay. So let's get to the verdict. Let's remove this big picture of Syndra. I forgot to say that this is going to be the big reveal when I remove this of like takeaways. So some further thoughts. You should find sources to learn from about League to more efficiently use your time instead of watching Korean Challenger replays. Find trusted sources, use your judgment, ask players or coaches or streamers who you respect about different sources of educational League content. Even some of those players and some Challenger players are a bit one-dimensional, meaning that they understand one thing about the game really well and that's why they excel and get to high ranks, but don't understand it as a whole. And that's what makes the difference between a Challenger player and someone like Faker or Dopa. Where like, when Dopa is talking about something in League, like 99% of the time, he's giving you some really, really good solid information. And that's just because he understands the game super, super well. Whereas like some other Challenger player may not understand it at that level and may give out some misinformation on certain topics. I'm sure there's some things that they give out really good information on, but you always have to be willing to question what people say and figure out whether or not it's correct. So however you do that. TLDR, watch videos from trusted sources that are geared towards your elo or problems instead. So here's the, sort of the conclusion and the reasons I wrote down. Should I watch Korean Challenger replays to improve? Mr. JT, should I watch them? Are they worth it? Are they worth my time? In general, no. But here are some suitable reasons to watch them. And the most common reason is to gain specific champion knowledge or matchup knowledge at a high level of play, which with this, please watch a decent amount of games from both sides of the matchup winning, so like watch it when, champion A wins and watch it when champion B wins multiple times from both sides, and hopefully there's enough videos on YouTube to cover that. I mean, even if some of them are dated, a lot of matchups haven't really changed very much unless champions have been reworked or heavily buffed or nerfed. A lot of matchups still play sort of the same as they did a few years ago. Now take that with a grain of salt, like items have changed, things like that have changed, but it all comes back to what I was talking about, where like you need to be able to draw your own conclusions from like the information presented. So watch it from both sides of the matchup when they're winning to gain a more full understanding, because one of the players could be autofilled or unfamiliar with the matchup, or play their side of the matchup poorly and get stomped, which is why it's so important to understand what they did, what they could have done differently, and why something worked or didn't work. Okay, now that's kind of the big thing right there. Like this part of the sentence, it's so important to understand what they did, what they could have done differently, and why something worked or didn't work. Okay, that's a lot of looking at League of Legends replays as a whole. If you can do this, then you should be able to get to Challenger. Like critical thinking is somewhat difficult, especially when you are like a novice at something. But over time, yeah. Okay, moving on. If you want to go into a League of Legends profession, that can be a good reason to watch Korean Challenger replays. Yeah, I don't think there's too much elaboration needed for that. If you want to be a coach or pro player or a caster, like I mentioned before, it's good to be educated about the game and to watch it, or at least watch solo queue at the highest level. Another reason is if you're a Diamond Plus player and you're able to interpret what you're seeing, once again, being able to understand what they did, what they could have done differently, why something worked or didn't work, just again stressing that the importance of that. And this is not to say that you're not allowed to watch Korean Challenger replays. Like I've said, if you can interpret the information, then watch away. If you're getting a lot out of it, if you're climbing, learning a lot, watching these replays, then by all means continue. This is just my recommendation, and it's to help people out who ask the question. I see the question all the time about, like, should I watch Korean Challenger replays? And I also see the suggestion given out that you should. And finally, it's entertainment that has some educational value. You know, if you're eating your meal and you're like, oh, I want to watch some League of Legends solo queue because, you know, it'll be entertaining and I'll possibly learn something from it too. So there's always a lot to learn from these replays. And it's just the question of, can you draw that, you know, that gold out from like the river or whatever? Can you pan out the gold, the pieces of information that'll really help you to get better from this very dirty, mucky water? Sort of a weird analogy, but like it gets to the point. I feel like you need to be able to understand the game. So I hope this is helpful for you guys, and I'm going to try to do more of these videos as well that you can just listen to in the background, and peaceful music, and have these things listed here in case you want to read them out yourself. And that's pretty much it. So thank you very much for watching. Let me know if you want to hear my thoughts on some other topics, and have a good one, everybody.